What you're going to hear about is growing up in a Baba family. So, Meherwan Irani. Hey, Baba.
All right, Jai Baba, everybody. So I've been wondering, what to talk about, because this is a brand new experience for me, giving a talk. And I did a poll, and it seems like the top 2 burning topics that everybody wants to know more about is, number 1, if you're saying the prayers in the forest at 7 a.m. but no one's there to hear you, does it count as an arthi? And number 2 is if you use your frequent flyer miles or points from your credit card to fly to India, does it still count as a spiritual journey? So we will discuss these very important topics and more this afternoon, but let me start at the beginning. I was born on January 12, 1970, roughly 19 days short of the anniversary of the Avatar of the Age dropping his physical form. And that by itself would have been another ordinary event. A child is born. But what's extraordinary is that about a year prior, at my mom and dad's wedding, which was the last public event that Baba did, and you'll hear more about that tonight, that my entire existence, if you will, was preordained. And it wasn't just preordained, it was preordained very specifically and going way, way back. I mean, you heard Mom's and Dad's stories last night, and one of the ones that struck me was when they recounted how when Baba had my mom in his lap as a baby, he told my dad that that was when I decided that she would be for you, that you would be together. And you'll hear more about, obviously, tonight, their wedding and the events that followed. But I'll focus a little bit on the part where I feel like I come into the picture. And much of this is based on hearing them tell these stories over and over again. So for me, sometimes it feels like a memory of a memory, and that line between, did I actually experience this, or just have I heard it so many times that it feels like I experienced this, has become blurred. But at some point, when my mom and dad my mom specifically was trying to figure out when she can come back from England, because Baba had said that after she and my dad got married that they should go and live there. Baba told my mom and my dad that he would bless them with 1 child. And this is again me recounting the way I've heard it from my parents, is my mom had the thought in her head that, well, that could take just about a year. And almost interrupting her thoughts, Baba said, no, I'll give you 2 children, 2 boys. And he said, I have many, many beautiful souls in my godown. So, godown is the Indian word for warehouse. And he said, why 1? Let's give you 2. But then he, specifically spelt out my name. And let me tell you, it's a very surreal experience to think about your existence being literally, not figuratively, but literally spelt out by the Avatar, because he was using sign language at the time, and he spelt my name out Meherwan, Meherwan, not his name, Meherwan, which is a Parsi contraction of the more formal Persian name Meherwan, henceforth Meher Baba, Meher meaning compassionate. Sorry. Thank you. But then there's a sequence to the story, and my parents can tell you the sequence better than I can, but at one point he told my parents who these 2 souls would be. He said, I'll give you, I believe he first said Love and Kush. And Love and Kush were the sons of the second Avatar of the Age after Zoroaster, Rama. Essentially the founder of Hinduism in India, the first Hindu Avatar. And it's a tragic tale, semi-tragic tale of Love and Kush, where they're sent away by their father to live with their mother in exile because of what he felt was his dharma, and how a great battle at one point ensued between Love and Kush and Ram before a reconciliation. And again, I've heard my mom tell a version of the story where, in her mind, just as she started thinking to herself, Love and Kush, Baba sort of interrupted and said, well, actually, I'll do better. I'll give you Dhruv and Prahlad. And Dhruv and Prahlad are two figures from Hindu mythology that are renowned in Indian mythology because of their love and devotion for their beloved. Both of them, at separate periods of time, both of them set upon a journey of discovery because not realizing who their father really was. I'll tell you briefly the story of Dhruv. Dhruv was born to a king and queen, but when he was a young boy, the king remarried a younger, more beautiful queen who was jockeying for position for her son to be the heir to the throne. So she did everything in her power to essentially make the king disavow his wife and their first son, Dhruv. And at one point, Dhruv came running in to sit onto his father's lap on the throne, and he was roughly pulled aside by the new wife and said, this is not your father. Leave. So he went running back to his mother in tears, saying, why is he not my father? Why is this king not my father? And his mother, to console him, said, your father is Vishnu, which is one of the three, the sustainer, the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer, and Vishnu is the preserver of the triumvirate of the Hindu gods. So Dhruv then decided, and I'm shortening the story obviously, that he would go and search for Vishnu, his real father. And it's an epic story and a classic in Hindu mythology, that because of the love of this boy and this absolute desire to seek Vishnu out and to find him, he literally turned heaven and earth upside down. The gods couldn't breathe because of the air, because when Dhruv stopped breathing, literally the oxygen out of the air was sucked out. And finally, Vishnu appears to Dhruv and acknowledges that he is indeed his divine father. And the story ends somewhat happily, where Dhruv goes back to where his father realized the errors of his ways and welcomed him back. But the story is a metaphor for essentially the devotion that Dhruv had for Vishnu, so much so that he willed Vishnu into existence as his father. Well, as a child, when I was born, I was blissfully unaware of all of this. And for most of my childhood, I was completely unaware of the story of the preordainment of my birth and that of my brother. Why? Well, because growing up in India, you all, Westerners, were coming to hear the Mandali speak. And they were there to tell the stories of the time of their beloved. And these beautiful little side stories of all the lives of people that Baba had played such a role in, unless they were being told specifically by the Mandali, were stories you were unlikely to hear at the time. And even if the story was told in some context or the other, I was too young to pay attention or even note it in my mind. It was only as an adult, in fact, when I first came to America, that I'm consciously aware of this sort of, what I consider this epic saga of my parents' wedding and coming, how Baba arranged the whole thing and the story of that happened around the time Baba said, you will have this boy and his brother. And I believe one of the first times I heard their story that I know was, if not the first time, very early on was here at the Southeast Gathering. I was living in Columbia, South Carolina as a graduate student, which is how I got to know Chris and Ann. And they had come for one of the early Southeast Gatherings in the early 90s, and that's where my first recollection of hearing the story in this entirety is. As is the watching the video of their wedding. So let's talk a little bit about growing up in India with the Mandali. Again, I would describe my childhood as a very ordinary childhood in an extraordinary place and an extraordinary time. Mom and Dad speak often how Baba, in retrospect, looks back and has perfectly set into motion everything that's meant to be. So by the time they came back from England, when I was just under 4 years of age, or just about 4, my brother had just been born, and following Baba's directive, Mom and Dad, as soon as they had their second child, came right back to India. They arrived at Vilu Villa just as you all started to show up. And there I was, this little kid of 4 and 5 years old, being fully and completely immersed in the wave of love and inquiry and discovery that was happening before my eyes by many of you here and many Baba lovers from the West that I consider almost like family, and you all were in your 20s when this was happening. Not that I was consciously aware of this. I was running around just at Vilu Villa, essentially soaking this up, not recognizing at the time what an incredible thing was happening here. Because here's what was happening, now that I can reflect back on it. I belonged to no religion. What do I mean by that? My mom, born a Hindu, grew up in a Hindu family, but by the time I came, she was not practicing Hinduism, and she was completely a Babler. My dad was born into a Zoroastrian family, but being born into Baba's family was not a practiced Zoroastrian, so I had no real connection with that part of my faith. And it's atypical for a Zoroastrian to marry outside of their faith, or a Hindu to marry outside their faith. So I'm the product of a very atypical marriage, communion in India. And instead of a normal childhood growing up as a Maharashtrian boy in a dusty little backwater for town in the middle of nowhere, the world was arriving at our doorstep. And this exposure to Western thought, Western culture, Western ideas informed me more than growing up as anything else. Yes, I was partly Indian, and partly Western. And when I look back, I recognize that what was happening was this harmonious balancing of both the West and the East that was preparing me for life as an adult and when I came to the West. And a big part of how I feel like my life has progressed has been because of this early exposure to the best, in my mind, of both worlds, without any attachment to any one thing. I'm not a Hindu, I'm not a Zoroastrian, I'm not a Parsi, I'm not perfectly Indian, I'm not perfectly American. I kind of felt like I was this hodgepodge of cultures and influences. Stories of the Wild Wild West influenced me as much as stories of the Mahabharata. I knew Indian history as well as I knew American history. And I grew up with the first language I probably heard being English. Living in England, that was my native tongue. So I didn't even have a native tongue that belonged to what was to be my native country. Hindi and Gujarati, I was never fluent in or had the same vocabulary as I did in English. So moving on to growing up in India and in Nagar when I arrived, you all got to experience the Mandali completely differently than I did. Because while I can see now, looking back, that for you all arriving in India, the Mandali were sort of a personification of the Avatar's time and life on Earth. They were there to tell his stories. They were there to convey what it was like to live with him, to sort of impart upon you all this idea of the Avatar in human form. And I felt like when I saw them interacting with you, they were different people. They had to be so. You all showed up and they had to be there for you. They had to carry on Baba's work of spreading his love amongst his followers that were coming there. But they didn't need to do that with me or anybody that was considered family. We were just kids and probably nuisances as kids. So my experience of the Mandali was more of, I would say, the human attributes of all of us. Mani to me was an aunt, Mani auntie, and she was the matriarch of the family. When it was all said and done, the head of the family was Mani. My grandfather, Adi Jr., was A in England and then B after he passed away. Mani was effectively the senior-most person in the family. She was my dad's direct aunt, and as such, the de facto head of the family. Any issue, anything that came up, a familial issue, a monetary issue, any conflict, we all went to Mani. I got hauled up before Mani, I can't tell you how many countless times, by my parents because of misbehavior or misdeeds. And to me, Mani was brilliant and sharp-edged and way smarter than I was and could read through me like a book. And my relationship with her was one always of, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And that's why I'm getting called up in front of Mani. But I could see her interacting with you all, and sort of in a Greek tragedy, the two masks live side by side. I could see that mask come on. Well, I say mask, and I don't mean that, ill-advisedly. I mean that it was an incredible transformation to be able to serve the needs of the people that were coming to see her. And, for me, Aloba was this scary, gruff guy that was constantly yelling at us because we were running around Merzad, turning on water taps, digging up the garden, creating havoc. And yet there was this tender side to him where a couple of times I remember Alaba calling me and my brother, and we're 8, 9 years old, into his little room and sitting down and inquiring about our classes and how things were going. And, we weren't sure if we were there because we were in trouble or whether, but it was genuine. And he always would have a little dessert or something hidden, like a little piece of cake that he'd then share with us and send us off on our way. And then, of course, the next time we were there, he'd be yelling at us about something. Pendu was this jovial person, this jokester. I thought of him as the court jester of Meherazad. I'd show up and I'd go running over because there'd always be a small group of Bible lovers telling Pendu dirty jokes. And as a little kid, I wanted to be in on them. Peter Nordine famously was one of the ones who would always tell him slightly risque jokes, and he loved it so. And then Tume Meru was just stern, and I just felt like there was a sort of a solemn sternness to her, and you just kind of didn't mess with Meru. But there were countless afternoons where she'd seen me and my brother bored out of our minds at Meherazad and would call us over and play a little game of pick up sticks or cards. Naja was motherly, but almost overwhelmingly so. She would feed you till you were about to burst. And I didn't dare not finish the meal, even though it was impossible to choke down because it was Naja, and if you didn't eat it all, I felt like we were somehow dishonoring her. And Erich, of all, Erich was to me, the sort of the wise man, the old wise man of Meherazad. And I'm telling you reflections of what it was like when I was a kid. And God, I wish I'd spent more time in Mandali Hall listening to his stories, because the few times I did, I still vividly remember and are formative in the way I think about the life in the world. And he too would bring me and my brother into his room once in a while and sit down and interact with us and play with us and talk to us, but always with a sense of wisdom and kindness and gravitas, and it just radiated off of him. Even as a kid, I felt that so strongly. And of course, there were so many other Mandali, and we had our individual relationships with each one of them. But where does Baba come into all of this, right? Where's that first sense that, okay, you had this extraordinary event happen that led to your birth that was so specifically ordained, but I'm living for what it seemed like this perfectly ordinary life. I've had 3 dreams of Baba in my entire life. And let me recount the first, because it happened right around then. I don't know how old I was, maybe Mom remembers, but I want to say I was probably 7, 8, 9 years old. It was summertime, and I remember that because Jack Caraco was staying at the trust office sort of as a resident, and I know it was summertime because none of the Western pilgrims were there, but he would bicycle over to Vila Villa once in a while, every couple of weeks, and have tea or sometimes dinner with my parents. And many of the residents would sort of come by Vila Villa when things were quiet and nobody was staying there. So I remember the dream, parts of it. I don't remember recounting the dream to anybody, but I must have, because here's how the story goes. The dream that I still vividly remember to now is I'm a young boy, 7, 8, 9 years old, and I'm walking up Seclusion Hill holding Baba's hand. And we're on the lower slopes of Seclusion Hill, and it's a beautiful day. I remember a light breeze, and the sun is behind Baba as Baba's walking this way, I'm holding, his left hand, because my right hand is in his left hand. And when I look up at him, the sun is behind him, and it's shining almost through him, but his hair is in a halo because of the sun behind him. And this is a young Baba in his 30s, strong, young, with long strides, and I'm scampering alongside to keep up, but my hand is firmly in his hand. And there's this incredible feeling of holding Baba's hand, more a familial feeling, one of safety and security, not necessarily one of, having a divine or spiritual experience. I'm a young boy. And then the scene changes, and we're at the top of Seclusion Hill. In my dream, I don't remember how we got up there. And at the top, it is cold and horrible. I look above, and the sky is black and ominous. The wind is howling. I'm freezing. I'm holding Baba's hand tightly because I feel like I'm at the top of the world, at the very, very tippy top of the world, on a tiny point, and that if I let go of his hand, I'm going to fall down. I'm going to tumble down all the way to the bottom. And when I look down from the top of the world, top of Seclusion Hill, the earth is shattered. The ground is torn up. It's happening actively, as if earthquakes are ripping apart the very fabric of the earth. And then I wake up. I don't remember telling this story to anybody, and I don't remember the other part. But at some point, Jacko comes over and visits with mom and dad and says, by the way, I had this bizarre dream. And he proceeds to recount to my mom and dad pretty much the dream that I'd related to them. Well, imagine spending the rest of your adult life trying to figure out what that means. So let's put a pin in that dream for a second, because this will come back in when we talk about the second and the third dreams. So I spent, my teenage years growing up with this sort of slowly changing relationship with the Mandali as I went from being a boy to then a teenager and eventually an adolescent and young adult. And the first time that happened was, I distinctly remember, when I didn't hug Mehera anymore. As you may know, Mehera had been given instructions, for men not to touch her. But as a boy, that was never a problem. I'd come running over and give Mehera a hug, and she'd hug me right back. And I remember distinctly the day where, not told by anybody, not prompted by anybody, maybe I was 13, maybe it was my first teen year, that I come to see Mehera, and instead of coming for her to hug her, I just folded my hands and said Jai Baba to her. And, just almost as if it was a clear understanding between both of us that something had changed, she folded her hands and said Jai Baba back to me. And from that age onwards, it felt like there was more of an intensity coming off of Mehera, Mani, Erich, the Mandali you all know, in terms of making sure I was always doing the right thing. The conversations, the playfulness for me of the Mandali was slowly slipping away, and more of the, making sure that a boy and a child turns into a man was happening. Again, in the moment, you're not aware of this, but it's when you look back, I realized that that was happening. Conversations would be more specific, they'd be more intense, there'd be more about behavior and thought and remembering Baba. Erich, I remember one time, holds me and my brother and said, which one of you is better? And both of us, still being childish, said, well, I'm better, Erich. And my brother's like, no, I'm better. And Erich says, when Baba was asked that one time as a young boy who was the better child, Baba had always pointed to his brothers as being better than him and to his siblings. Mani was born much after that point. And I remember Erich telling me that story, and I remember the time, like, what am I supposed to do with that? And then I remember Bauji giving me a discourse on how to judge people, which again, as a teenager, was just completely over my head. But I still remember that conversation with Bauji, and remember the time being perplexed as to why I was being told on how to be a good judge of people, how to be a good judge of character. Let's jump forward a little bit, shall we? So I grew up, and let's see, where should I take this next? Well, the first understanding I had that I was in the middle of a sea change in terms of time with the Mandali was the passing of Mehera. I mean, other people had passed away before then. My grandfather, Adi Jr., had passed away, and his ashes were bound to be interned. Pendu had passed away. Faramji, working Boxwell, had passed away, and I attended all those funerals in Lower Meherabad. But this was the first time where it struck me that this is something that was real, that something really was changing here. Mom, what year was it, 89? 89, yeah. So Mom and Dad had left me alone at the house, because at this point I was old enough to be left alone, and they had both gone traveling. Mom, you were in North India, Dehradun, right? and Dad was in the U.S. So they left me at home, and Mom knew that Mehera wasn't doing well. So she had given me very specific instructions that if Mehera's health takes a turn for the worse, please telegram immediately. Again, this is 89, no cell phones, no immediate phone calls, everything has to be, by telegram. So I assured her that I would, and sure enough, I started getting the news that Mehera's health was taking a turn for the worse. Bobby Street, who at this point become a good friend, was acting as a liaison where he'd check in with me almost every day and sometimes even come over to our house and hang out with me there, and then often I'd go to Meherabad with him, and he was sort of my liaison between what was happening with Mehera's health. So at the same time, and this is a slightly hilarious story, but ties into what happened, we had a little puppy. And I was in charge of also taking care of this puppy while my mom was gone, my dad was gone. And something happened, and the puppy got bit by another dog and contracted rabies. Well, I didn't know that immediately. All of a sudden, this dog's acting very strange and nipping everybody. So I get Erico involved, and the local expert on rabid dogs had disposed or dispatched of many a rabid dog. He comes over, takes a look, and says, "Yeah, you got yourself a rabid dog." So, I'm perplexed right now. So Bobby's like, "Well, let me telegram your mom and dad and let them know what's going on. Mehera's health is taking a turn for the worse, and we just got confirmation that the dog has rabies." Oh, I know what it was. We wanted to make sure my parents were not, in case they were exposed to rabies, my mom should also get a rabies shot while she's there then. So the first telegram goes out, and this is what my mom receives, because this is how the telegram read. No, sorry. The first telegram went out saying, "We think dog might have rabies." It never got to her. The second telegram goes out, "Mehera in critical condition, take rabies shot immediately." Mom, because she got the second telegram and came rushing home, but she missed Mehera's passing away by a matter of hours. And I was there, and I had to go up to the tomb, and I remember being up there with Ted, who was organizing the unearthing of the grave where Mehera's body was to be buried. That's when I found out that the residents living at Meherabad that had the forethought, because the ground was so rocky and so hard and would have taken so long to dig, to pre-dig Mehera's grave and then refill it back in, so that when the time did come, this could happen very quickly. So I'm there helping with the local Arangan workers and with Ted remove and excavate some of the gravel and the stones. And the funeral was to happen shortly after, but I remember Ted planning everything meticulously. He wanted to make sure that we practiced the lowering of Mehera's casket into the ground. And so we had a dummy casket, and we had these sort of straps which went under the casket so you could lower it down, and then the straps would be removed. And the twins from Pune were supposed to arrive and be two of the people that were going to be on either side of the casket, and I forget who else was on the other side. But since the twins weren't there, I was asked to sub in to be a person that did the practice run. So I sort of did this dry run with lowering the casket at one end, and it was as solemn as if the actual ceremony was happening. Mehera's body was still at Meherazad, and people were visiting her, and my mom had just arrived, and she'd gone over to Meherazad to be there and keep that last vigil over the body. So I do that, and it felt really sort of somber and deep, and then quickly after, I hopped on my motorcycle and went over to Meherazad to file by Mehera's body in the last sort of goodbye to her. And I come into the room where Mehera's body is on the bed, and I vividly can see Goher weeping in the corner, just tears pouring down her eyes. And Mani, also red-faced, but still somewhat trying to organize the people filing past her. So I came by and in a respectful way, sort of not quite sure how close to get to her body, sort of stood back and just folded my hands. And I remember looking over at Goher. For some reason, my eyes were drawn to her. And as she's crying, she looks up at me, and there's almost this beseeching look in her eyes, as if she's asking for something, but I don't know what it is. And then I hear Mani saying, go closer, almost bow down. And I awkwardly then come forward, and the point of the story is, because I was confused by what Mani was telling me and this image of Gore in my head, I leaned forward to bow to her and accidentally touched her feet with my head. So a full life had passed before the last time I hugged her. I never told this to anybody. I never recounted this to anybody, because in the moment I was, it just happened, and then I just sort of left out of that room. And that's the moment where it hit me that this childhood, this upbringing that I had with the Mandali there, that this was the beginning of the end. So in 1990, I then come to the States, to America, and I arrive, second dream that I've ever had before I come to America. I dream that my puppy is lost. Well, let me back up. Sorry. I have a dream that Baba is taking a whole bunch of Westerners, Eastern and Western followers of his, somewhere on a hike. I remember the hike being on top of almost a cliff, because there was a sheer drop to one side and a narrow path. And Baba's walking in the path, and everybody's streaming behind him, and it's almost like an Amrit atmosphere, a festive atmosphere. And I'm there with my puppy, running after Baba, sort of just, being in that festive atmosphere. There's an event happening, and Baba's up there. And then the next thing I know is my puppy's lost. I can't find this puppy, and I'm running around frantically trying to find this puppy. And now it's dark, and everybody's left, and I'm still up on that cliffside looking for this puppy, and I can't find this puppy. And finally, it's late and it's dark, and I come back, and for some reason, it's back to Vilu Villa, which is where I'd lived when I was younger. And when I arrive at Vilu Villa, just completely distraught, I come in from the back entrance to the dining room. There was a main entrance through the house into the dining room, and there was a back entrance from the kitchen side. And it's a tiny little swinging door with a screen on it. But when you come in through that door, you're coming in and facing straight away the spot where Vilu would sit at the head of the table. And I opened the door, and Baba's sitting in that chair, in Vilu's chair, facing the door as if expecting me to walk in, and the puppy's on his lap. That's dream number 2. I come to America at the age of 20, and this is where what I felt was an ordinary childhood without any special markers or signs, that there was some point to having what felt like a preordained birth, some reason that I'm supposed to be here, started to come more into focus and become more something that I started actively thinking about. And I arrive at the center and in Myrtle Beach for the first time, and was overwhelmed by the warmth of the Western, what I considered visitors that had seen me growing up, greeting me into their homes, inviting me out for lunch, inviting me out for dinner. And it was a brand new experience to me. For the first time, I felt probably the way you all felt when we first came to India, and were overwhelmed by the warmth and the welcoming into their homes. And there's too many amazing stories to recount, but the one that stuck with me all these years is I'd been there for scarcely 3 weeks, and I'm staying at the Rubens, Elliot and Della Rubens' house, when Kitty calls. And I barely knew Kitty. I'd just met her once in India. And she wanted me to come over for lunch on Sunday. So, of course, I went over. And I arrive, and it's Kitty and Jane Haynes and Stella Hernandez and Joy Miller, and essentially everybody around the table was 70 years old or older. And I was like, oh, this isn't like Sunday lunch, let's invite a bunch of people. This is like Sunday's ladies' lunch. And Kitty probably thought it convenient, let's get this 20-year-old kid from India also to join the lunch. So I have lunch with them all, and, they're all having conversation and trying to make some polite conversation with me, but, we're worlds apart. And I thought that would be the end of that. And next week on a Sunday, I don't know what I'm doing, where all of a sudden somebody comes racing to find me and said, they're asking about you, where are you? I'm like, who? Lunch at Kitty's. I'm like, that was last week. No, this week too. Okay, I race over. For, I think, 11 or 12 weeks, I had to go have lunch every Sunday afternoon at Kitty's with this group of women. And again, for the life of me, I have no idea what I was doing there or why Kitty wanted me to have lunch there. That was not a great conversationalist. There wasn't any stories of India I was telling them. I was just simply there. But I got to observe, again, what in my mind was, I guess, the equivalent of, this Western elder statesman, Mandali kind of interaction, and it was a really sweet memory. One of the funny stories of the time was towards, Kitty would often fall asleep at the table while we were having lunch. And one afternoon, we're there having lunch, and she falls asleep, and suddenly, and everybody ignored her when she fell asleep, but like the conversation was still continuing around her. All of a sudden she popped up and said, oh, the boy, from deep sleep. And I think it was Jane who leaned over, maybe Stella, and said, what boy, Kitty? The boy, the Indian boy. And what about him? From the Rubens. We must call him. He's not here. So somewhere deep in Kitty's consciousness was the sense that the boy should be present at all times. So the next hint that I had that Baba was starting to sort of like make sure I understood that he had some hand in the way my life would progress was I come back home to the Rubens, and Elliot says, oh, there was a call for you, a message from Danny Ladinsky. And I said, oh yeah, well, what's the message? He said, well, he left a message that Molly Hay, Marshall and Roz's daughter, is visiting Myrtle Beach for a few days, and the thought just occurred to him that I must be lonely and alone with, from India, and maybe, since Molly and I are the same age, that, she could keep me company for a little bit and just sort of, and I was like, okay, fine, well, but how do I find her? And, it's like, I don't know, maybe she's in the center. So I go wandering out of the center, and I had a vague memory in my head of what Molly Hay looked like because she had visited India as a child. And I also knew that her and I shared the same birthday. We were born on January 12th, 1978, exactly the same day. So I kind of go like, trying to find someone that I think might look like a Molly Hay, some picture in my head of whatever. And I get to the original kitchen, and walking along the path right in front of the original kitchen is indisputably, undoubtedly Molly Hay. Long hair, flowing skirt, cowboy hat. And I'm like, excuse me, are you Molly? And she flashes that 1,000-watt Molly Irani smile that you probably all have seen. And she says, yes. And I said, oh, I'm Meherwan from India. And the thing was, Danny hadn't told her that he had left me a message wanting me to connect with her. So she was like, oh, yeah, hi. And I'm acting like she knows why I'm there. And I said, well, I was just coming to say hello and hang out. And she said, well, I'm catching my flight back to California in 30 minutes, but I'd just come on the center to go to the Lagoon Cabin before I took the car to go to the airport. So we spent about 30 minutes just chatting in the original kitchen, and then she took off, and that was my first vision of Molly Hay. But the point being, we all go through life and we go, if not for that one moment, that left turn, that pause, that hesitation, that I didn't catch that flight, how would life have been differently? And I can promise you, if it wasn't for that one 30-minute window on the center where I ran into Molly Hay, I don't think our lives would have been completely different. Because in that moment, again, I left with the sense that something important had just happened over here. Aw. I know. Keep looking. I'm like, how much longer I got to keep going? So, let's fast forward a little bit then to sort of the next event in my life where I felt like Baba just played such a huge hand. I mean, yes, Molly. I started waiting tables in Latif's, Roz's restaurant, Molly's mom's restaurant, and one summer, Molly came also to wait tables at Latif's because she was trying to save some money to go traveling and spend a semester abroad, go on a tour of Mont Blanc and then go to India and do the Annapurna Trail in Nepal. So we met, and I fell head over heels in love with her, but was a shy boy from India and didn't quite know how to tell her that I was head over heels in love with her. And she then finished up the summer and left to go to on her tour, her European trip, and I came to work the next day with my stomach hurting, as if I had bad indigestion, and just feeling kind of like, just pale and weak and sweaty. And my manager, Rika, who was also from India and I had become friends with, says, "Are you okay?" I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with me. "Do you have a fever?" I'm like, "No, I don't have a fever." "Did you eat something bad?" "No, I didn't eat anything bad last night." "Are you feeling anything else?" "No, I'm not feeling anything else." And she looks at me, she goes, "Oh my God, you're lovesick." And I say, "That's ridiculous. That's just a thing. People actually don't get lovesick." And she says, "No, you're lovesick." And she was absolutely right. The minute I stopped and thought about it, that's why my stomach was hurting, because I had felt like I had an opportunity that I'd let slip through my fingers for something important here, that feeling that I had when I first seen it in the center, and I'd just kind of blown it. And fast forwarding, 6 months go by, and I get a call from Roz Taubman, saying that, "Hey, Molly is coming back for Christmas. I know you and her became friends while working at Latif's. Would you like to come and spend Christmas with us?" Looking back, she was probably playing matchmaker, but the match happened. That Christmas, Molly and I professed a love for each other, and blah-de-blah. But the point of the story is, very quickly, my parents found out that, I was madly in love with Molly. I had moved to California to be with her. We were living together. And they said, "Well, you've got to get engaged." And so Molly and I came to India to get engaged in 94. Right, Mom? Sorry. Winter of 1994. And you know how Mom describes how Baba arranged every single thing about their wedding? I felt like Mani Auntie and the women Mandali arranged every single thing about this engagement. We were both 24, didn't really know, still kids basically. And we show up, and it's a thing, it's an event. I mean, they're plans being made, outfits being picked out, outfits for Molly, outfits for Roz, outfits for everybody, the guest list, who's coming, who's not coming, the ceremony, exactly how everything will work. So on the day off, we just sort of showed up and being told what to wear. And Molly was wearing, Mom, tell me again, what sari did you give her? So Mom pulled out her engagement sari, and then there's a beautiful story of finding that sari also, right? Going to Bombay with Arnavaz.
That was wedding sari, but engagement I didn't even see that. Engagement did, Mehera and Baba gave me that.
There you go. So Molly's wearing that sari, and I'm the skinny little Indian kid in an oversized suit, And I don't remember much off the ceremony. It happened in our house, Meherwan, but it was conducted by Mani Auntie. She's during the ceremony. We're standing on the little wooden platform. It was half Parsi, half Baba. Some of the tokens of Parsi ceremonies, the silver tray with all of the doodads upon it, breaking of the coconut, waving of eggs over us to ward off the evil spirits. All of that I remember. And it all is a little bit of a blur, but when everything slows down and comes in a sharp focus is when we went to garland Baba's picture. Baba's picture was on the wall above Dad's Nakamichi stereo system, because where else would it be? And it was the cabinet where he kept all of his sound system stuff, his beloved, and our beloved was above his beloved. And we go up to the picture frame, and Molly and I garland it together with Money directing us. And we put the garland, Molly on one side and myself on the other side. And Money goes, we all go Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai, and we put the thing on. And then the next thing to be done was a little, tilak, sort of the red dot for good luck. One was on my forehead with a little bit of rice stuck to it. One was on Molly's forehead, and Money wanted to do one for Baba. So she told me and Molly to go ahead and put the tilak. So it's like a little matchstick dipped in a red paste, then you apply the paste to the forehead. Well, it's very difficult on a picture hanging on a wall that's one-dimensional. Like, I didn't know how to get it on there without my hand covering Baba's face as I'm doing it. So I'm awkwardly up there trying to position myself, and Money very gently takes my hand. And she says, "Here, let me show you." And she guides my hand, and she moves it around the picture and very elegantly helps me come from over and above Baba's head this way, instead of like me trying to do it this way on Baba's face. This way, and holding my hand, she helps me put the tilak on Baba's forehead right in the picture. And, and she looks at the picture, and she reaches up and does a micro adjustment of the picture. And she looks at me and says, "Look how beautiful he is." And it was a sister looking at an elder brother, marveling at his handsomeness. That's what I felt, not, a devotee admiring God, but a younger sister who misses her older brother, because this was a family moment. And that picture is just so imprinted. And that's the first time I saw Money Auntie for who she really was. My entire childhood was this sharp-edged, acerbic-tongued, disciplinarian, the matriarch of the family, the final say on everything, smarter than anybody in the room, could put on a show with the best of them, could turn on the money charm and have you eating out of her hand. But in that moment, I saw her as Baba's younger sister, who was madly and completely in love with her elder brother. And everything else was a role she was playing and had to play, because that was what was ordained for her. So Molly and I then moved back to the U.S., and we got married in America, and it was incredible the amount of people that showed up, a few of whom are in the audience here today. And we started off our life as a couple. And if there are sort of 3 chapters to a story, my first chapter was growing up in India. The second chapter was coming of manhood and getting married in America. And the third chapter is Molly and I starting on our life together. And here's the thing, folks. When you grow up in a Baba family, there's kind of no choice, right? What did you call it? Congenital felicity. Right. And as I'm coming of age as a young adult and starting to think for myself, what is my relationship with Baba? I had a hard time figuring out if I had a relationship with Baba that wasn't other than one that was imposed upon me by growing up in a Baba family. I mean, not just a Baba family, but his family, right? My life was a life of tradition and rituals and reverence, not just as a Baba lover, but also being part of Baba family. Expectations of how to behave, expectations of how to think of him, how to love him. I mean, I woke up, I don't know at what age my dad started me and my brother, but I think I was probably 5, when we woke up every morning, and from the age of 5 until I left when I was 20, we said the Arthi every morning at 7 o'clock, come rain or shine, right? So my relationship with Baba was informed by these very seemingly, at the time, rigid do's and don'ts from my parents, from the community, from the Mandali. That was it. So here I am for the first time trying to figure out my own personal relationship with Baba. Do I have one other than one that has been conferred upon me? And this is where Baba really starts to tick for me. I started reading a lot. Growing up in India, I didn't read Baba books. I mean, I was there hanging out with Mandali, hearing their stories. I started reading, and I started exploring for myself, what is it that you all saw in him, in the Mandali, that attracted you, that pulled you into him? I became fascinated with stories. Erich's That's How It Was, Balnatu's series of books on Westerners, coming to Baba, searching for in there some validation that this is something that I too can feel, that's not just, what I've grown up with, but something I've found for myself. And it was elusive. And right around that time, I felt like Baba started sending me very direct signs. If I was looking for miracles, he was sending them my way, and I was just too dumb and too caught up in my own thoughts to see them. One small such incident, I'm driving back from work. I was now working in the auto industry. I was working at a Lexus dealership. And I stopped by to some light came on my car, like a check engine light. And literally driving back down 19th Avenue in San Francisco, I pulled into a repair station that was right there on 19th just to have a mechanic look at it. And this young man that looks like he could have been either South American, Latin, Asian, sort of like brown skin like me, but indeterminate to me of what ethnicity or nationality he was, comes out, and I say, hey, this light on my dashboard came on. Well, guess what's on my dashboard also? A Baba picture. And this young man, who was probably also the same age as me, looks in and says, oh, that's just an O2 center, an oxygen center that tripped, just to bring it, there's no emergency, just take it to a repair shop at some point and they can get that fixed. And I'm like, oh, okay, awesome, thanks. And then he says, who's that person? And I said, oh, well, because I'm awkward and there's a picture about it. And I say, that's a spiritual master in India and I believe in. And the guy goes, what's his name? And I say, oh, his name is Meher Baba. And he says, do you have any information on him? And I go, no, I don't have any information on him. And I said, he said, well, how could I get more information? And at the moment, the only thing I could think of was, what was it, The Box in Berkeley, Rick Chapman's, and I guess I must have the address on me somehow, but I said, well, write to this address, it was a P.O. box, and they'll send you something. And so that was just a small example of over and over again, things like that happening to me where, well, I'll tell you another one. I'm sitting there reading about atheism, reading the discourses, reading Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, renowned intellectual atheists trying to understand the other side of the equation here. And similarly reading, the discourses and sayings of Baba, and my brain's trying to reconcile. I guess I'm intellectually trying to figure out this thing called Meher Baba and my, my relationship with me as a person, as an adult now. So I show up for work one day and I tell my sales manager, Keith Katz, that I need to take a weekend off because I'm going somewhere. And he goes, where are you going? I go, Myrtle Beach. Now let me tell you a little bit about Keith Katz. Keith Katz was my sales manager. He was this short, awful jerk of a guy. Keith was the kind of guy, here's what Keith is like. One day I sold 5 cars in a single day, broke the dealership record for the most cars ever sold in a single day, unheard of. Most salespeople sold 10 cars in a month, I just sold one in one day. I was there till midnight. It was like, it just kept happening. I walk in the next morning, Keith says, so Meherwan, heard you sold 5 cars yesterday. I said, yeah. He said, well, even a blind pig gets an acorn now and then. This is Keith Katz. All right. So Keith goes, where are you going? I go, I'm going to Myrtle Beach, like, what does he care where I'm going? He goes, oh, do you know what's in Myrtle Beach? What? Like, what's Keith going to tell me? He goes, the Meher Baba Spiritual Center. And I go, how do you know about the Meher Baba Spiritual Center? He says, I met Meher Baba. I've been working with this guy for 4 years now. I'm like, when did you meet Meher Baba? He says, well, when I was a young man, when I was 18 or 19 years old, I was a cabbie in New York City. Keith was probably about 65 or 70 when we had this conversation. I was like, okay. He says, so one day I pick up a ride, and it's this gentleman, well-dressed, and he wants me to go to the Delmonico. because there's some big gathering there. So we start driving, and I'm a chatty guy, so I'm chatting with him. And he starts telling me that he's going there because there's an event happening, and he's going there to meet Meher Baba, who's in New York and having an event. And Keith goes, okay, and they get there, and Keith lets the ride out, and he couldn't tell me who the person was, obviously, he doesn't remember. All he remembers, he was dressed in a suit, he was well-dressed. And Keith says to me, well then, as the man's exiting the cab, he turns to me and says, would you like to come in and meet him? So Keith says, sure, he parks his cab, comes in, and describes entering this large room, and there's a ton of people in there. And he sees, he gets there just as some sort of line is passing by this person who has a basket next to him full of little buttons that he's handing out to everybody that passes by. So Keith says, I get in line. And I file by, and then I get to the person, because the individual that had escorted him had taken off by that point. Keith says I was just kind of on my own, so I just kind of went with the flow. I stood in line, and I passed by Meher Baba, and he hands me a button. And he says, all cabbies, he says, are very superstitious. We all have a little box in which we keep our good luck charms. And he says, we call it our little kit. And he says, rabbit's foot and, whatever you have you. And he said, so I put mine in my little kit, this button I was given. He says, and ever since then, I never had a ride stiff me, a weird incident. He says, it was almost like I was blessed. And he says, I still have it. I'll bring it in tomorrow. And the next day he brings out this little tin, and inside he literally had a rabbit's foot, a clover leaf, a dice, whatever, and a faded little Baba button. So here's Meher Baba. Every time I turn around, trying to tell me, like, knock, knock, you don't spend too much time thinking about this. I'm here. But I am really in the middle of almost an existential crisis about this. And this is when dream number 3 happens. I'm on the center. I think it's one of the New Year's Eve's programs. And for some reason, I'm just exhausted. I can't stay up for the square dance and the midnight arti. And that's a first for me. And Molly's a little surprised. She said, "Are you sure you're going to miss this?" I'm like, I can't even stand up. I just got to go and go to bed. So I go to the cabin and fall asleep. And this is the dream I have. That we're in Baba's house in the Myrtle Beach Center. And we're in that kitchen. And so there's the kitchen the way it is, and in the dream, the kitchen had a little L-shaped little leg where Mom is in there with me, frantically preparing a meal for Baba in that kitchen. And I'm with her, and she's frantic. She's stressed and scurrying around and trying to put together a dish. And then at one point, she says, "Go quickly. Baba may have been done eating, just check on him." And I go into the main body of the kitchen, which is where the fridge is and the cabinets are, and there's a little table there, right? And Baba's sitting at that table. And it's old Baba, like Baba as I imagine him in the late 60s, Old, and he's sitting there looking very thin and frail, and he's wearing a sadra and sort of like a lungi, not much, and he's looking agitated, really agitated. And I noticed that on his mustache, some food is stuck. So I awkwardly pick up a paper towel and try to brush the mustache, and he's looking annoyed as I'm doing this. And I keep trying to get at it because I felt like this is what my mom would want me to do, and he pushes my hand away, annoyed. And then he looks at me, and he's not speaking, and he's not signing, but he's saying to me, he says, "I know what's going on." He goes, "I know what you're thinking all the time." He says, "You don't believe in me. Fine, there's nothing else I can do." And then I wake up in a cold sweat. And I wake up and I literally remember saying to myself, "Baba, I never said I don't believe in you." I was just trying to find out for myself my relationship with you. And I told... So Molly comes back from the square dance, and she's got the Baba quotes. And see, I wasn't prepared for this, otherwise I'd have brought this thing with me. And she said, I told her this dream I had, because I'm still kind of shaken by this and just really sweating a little bit. And it's so vivid. I mean, I still remember how vivid it was and how annoyed Baba looked, how upset he looked. And I tell her, and Molly's like, whoa, that's intense. She said, well, here's your Baba quote. You know? And, man, give me a second and I'll tell you what the quote said, because I'll have to paraphrase. I wish it on me so I could read it perfectly for you. It basically said something along the line of that having faith or not having faith is immaterial. That the only thing that matters is, are you true to yourself? And I'm paraphrasing, it was a much longer quote, but that's what I got, and I still have it at home. And I guess that in that moment, that you know, everything shifted in me. I came back recognizing that I don't need to worry about whether I found him myself or whether he, you know, sort of like, you know, growing up in a Baba family, my belief in him sort of flowed through him to me. It essentially drove home that for me, well, let me put it this way. A bunch of Bob lovers here, so I have to be careful. No, I'm kidding. The takeaway for me was that Baba's divinity is in each one of us. What I mean by that is, I think of him as, you know, an avatar in a perfectly human body. And Baba says to himself, like, you know, this body is still perfectly human. And that Mandali that I grew up were also perfectly human. And that the lesson that I was meant to learn this whole time was how to be just a good human. To not worry about divinity or, you know, where I am on the spiritual path, or whether or not I've had a personal experience of him as God in human form myself. That it was okay to not have all those things. What was more important was to try to basically focus on being as perfectly flawed of a human being as I could be. And that's my spiritual path, I would say, in parting, that I try to live, is not trying to chase after something that's, you know, this spiritual path, if you will, but to more importantly to focus on what I see sort of emblazoned on his tomb for all to see when you walk up there, which is this idea of mastery and servitude. That just by being a perfectly flawed human being, that I have discovered the message that Baba has come to give us all, and including to me, that maybe this entire predestined, preordained birth was not to live an extraordinary life, but to live an ordinary life extremely well. And that's my, you know, if anybody would say, like, what's the is there a message? And if I was to give a talk like this, I would say that's kind of my message, would be that it's okay to give ourselves a break and to be just perfectly ordinary human beings. That's all we can be. And that's the message that Baba, I feel, and his Mandali showed me by being perfectly ordinary human beings. And I use the word perfectly and ordinarily, paradoxically, but that's what I saw. I saw Mani Auntie as a perfectly ordinary human being. I saw Erich as this perfectly ordinary, each one representing a human attribute that collectively makes up the human experience. Grace, wit, intelligence, wisdom, gruffness, anger, humility. They were all, these uncles and aunts of mine were all physical manifestations of what it means to be human, and Baba, as the perfect human, sort of showed us that it's okay to be flawed. It's okay to be just who we are. So I'll leave you all with that. Thank you so much. Avtar, Meher Baba, PJ.
Meherwan, before you leave, I have a proposal for you. Would you mind if people ask you questions for just a few minutes?
Sure.
We have a few minutes before, we have a half an hour before dinner time.
Yes.
So if anybody has just a few minutes of questions for Meherwan.
Delta miles are more spiritual than United miles. I'm just saying. Mom wants to know how much I love her. Yes.
You became like world-class chef.
Yes.
Were you thinking about Baba during that whole time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Chai Pani was another one of these examples of Baba, showing me that he's constantly doing his work, working on me. I mean, even Chai Pani is just a funny metaphor. It's a perfectly ordinary restaurant that's, suddenly got this extraordinary whatever, and it's Baba just saying, yes, you can be both at the same time. You can have a perfectly ordinary restaurant and have an extraordinary experience. When I gave my my acceptance speech, I basically referenced mastery and servitude as the guiding principle on which we run the restaurant. This idea that if everything you do you look at as an act of service, then you could possibly transform the world. And in my mind, there's a reason. This is my belief. There's a reason why, when it's all said and done, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, the only message of Baba that we may see may be the one that's emblazoned across his last and final resting place, which is mastery and servitude. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that message and why that's the one he chose to be the place where he'll rest for eternity.
That disgusted look that Baba gave you in that third dream, think about if he had not given you that disgusted look,
Oh, yeah.
or gave you a big smile, it would not have motivated you to make the changes.
Yeah, it was less of a change. It was just more of just an awakening. Yeah, it was just a realization, an awakening that I was trying, I was chasing after something that was, I was not going to be fulfilled that way.
It was the aggravation of the sand and the muscle that created the pearl.
I can't say it better.
What's next in your life? Anything you're just going to love Baba the rest of your life?
Well, it's to be it's to be just more open to these moments that I feel blessed that I keep getting constant reminders. My dad once told me that every time one of these things happens, it's Baba letting you know that you may not be thinking of him, but he's always thinking of you. And Chai Pani, to me, is that is become this giant receptacle for those moments and experiences where I'm constantly reminded that I may have forgotten him, but he's thinking of me. I'll give you a very short, quick one. This happens all the time, and this is just like one example of many. A family is sitting in a booth, an Indian family, booth one. And I, at this point, zip in and out of Chai Pani very quickly, because if I come in, I get stuck talking to people, and I've got meetings and work in the office. So I kind of come in, keep my head low, grab a cup of chai, and get out. So I come in, I grab a cup of chai, keep trying to keep my head low, and one of the servers whispers to me, because they all know to not just say this out loud. Hey, Meherwan, there's a table of Indians in table one, and they were asking if they could say hello to you. And I made the mistake of glancing over at them, and they're staring right at me. Can't do much. So I go over, and I introduce myself, and we start talking. And I mention I'm from Ahmednagar. And it's a younger couple, husband and wife, both Indian, and they look like they live in America, and they're very sort of Americanized. And their older mother quite older mother, probably in her 70s, who looks like she's visiting from India. And she said, "Oh, Ahmednagar, isn't that where Meher Baba's ashram is?" And I said, "Well, yes, are you familiar?" And she says, "I met Baba." I go, "You met Baba?" And she said, "Yes." And she tells me this incredible story. As a young girl, her and her best friend were traveling from Bombay to Pune with a driver, and the car broke down. And this woman that was telling me the story, the mother, her family home is in Pune. So they must have been in Bombay for some reason. And I know it sounds weird to send 2 kids in India, with just a driver, but that would happen actually all the time. My parents would ship me off with, a servant or Raju on a train or a bus to go somewhere. As long as you had an escort, it wasn't unusual. And this driver obviously was their escort. So the car breaks down on the Pune to the Bombay to Pune highway. And, this is, I forget when she's telling me this, but I think this is 50s. She says, so we're standing there's no phone, so all you can do is wait for the next vehicle to come by, and back then it could take a long time for another vehicle to come by. Well, all of a sudden, she describes as a big American car, right? This big American car comes by, and it's a convoy. It's not just that car, there's a couple cars behind it. And the car sees them and stops. And she said, a window rolls down, and she sees a man in the back seat looking at them, and then the window goes up, and suddenly the front door opens, and the driver pops out. And she said he was Indian, but he looked almost Western, tall, broad-shouldered, big, dressed as a Western suit. I'm thinking, Sarosh? Right? And he comes over and says, do you need a hand? And the driver explains, sir, I'm taking the girls to their family from Bombay to Pune, car broke down, etc. So the man goes back, the window rolls down again, he confers with the man in the back seat and comes back and said, come, we'll give you a ride. So the 2 girls hop in the front seat with, I guess, Sarosh. She didn't know, obviously, who these people were. And the man explains, he said, well, we can take you to Pune, but the person in the back needs to be at this location urgently, so we can't take you to your home. But when we get to this location, we can call your family and they can come pick you up. And she describes, driving in silence, complete silence, and then they get to Guru Prasad in Pune. And they get out of the car, and the man in the front said, what's your family, and I'll try to reach them. And she said, then the window in the back rolls down, and the man beckons the girls. They come, and she says, we could tell at this point that he was obviously a very spiritual person, because he was being treated with such reverence. And when we arrived at Guru Prasad, we could see the crowds awaiting them. I said, what did you do? She said, we just folded our hands like good Indian kids will do in the presence of any god or divinity. And he says, and he folded his hands back, and that was it. So every day, Baba will find a way to remind me that if I'm not thinking of him, he's thinking of me, and it seems to happen a lot at Chaipani. So. Thank you.